The work that you do in construction can expose you to some pretty serious hazards. That's why 1 out of every 5 workplace fatalities in the U.S. involves construction workers. Some of the most dangerous construction hazards can be found when you're in a hole or a depression that's been dug into the earth, also known as an excavation. Compared to other areas on a construction site, working in an excavation more than doubles your chances of being killed on the job. And some of the greatest excavation hazards can be encountered when you work in a trench. An average of 2 workers lose their lives every month when a trench they're working in collapses on them. But many of these deaths and thousands of injuries can be prevented. In this program, we'll show you how. We'll identify the hazards of trenching, explain the safety regulations that apply to this type of work, and look at the safe work practices that can make working in a trench as accident-free as possible. OSHA defines a trench as a narrow excavation, deeper than it is wide, and having a maximum width of just 15 feet. From a practical standpoint, trenches are challenging places to work because they are inherently dangerous. Trenches are naturally unstable because with the help of gravity, they gradually fill themselves up. In fact, all unsupported trenches will eventually collapse or cave in. So as you would expect, cave-ins are the most common type of accident in trenching work. They can happen without warning. They travel as fast as 20 feet per second, and they make very little noise. 1 cubic yard of soil can weigh more than a ton, so when a trench caves in, it can easily trap, crush, and suffocate the workers inside. There are other hazards that can be found in a trench as well. Digging in the ground can disturb nearby structures such as buildings, walls, and sidewalks, as well as natural surface features like trees or boulders, which can fall into the trench and onto anyone who is working there. Utility lines on the site may be carrying water, sewage, natural gas, or electricity. If they are mishandled or damaged, it can result in trenching workers being burned, electrocuted, drowned, or asphyxiated. Hazardous atmospheres can form in trenches dug near landfills and sewers or on sites that contain hazardous materials. These fumes, gases, and vapors can be colorless and odorless and can poison or suffocate workers, catch fire, or explode without warning. Rain and other water that makes its way into a trench not only increases the chances of a cave-in, but the sloppy conditions make it harder to move safely inside the trench and to get out fast if need be. Standing water also creates a drowning hazard. There are other physical hazards as well. Falls are the #1 cause of fatalities in construction, and workers can and do fall into trenches. Excavated earth, building materials, tools, equipment, even vehicles can fall into a trench too, and onto anyone working there. Surrounding traffic can also create hazards. Employees who are working in trenches that are located near active roadways or mass transit lines can be hit by passing vehicles. And over time, the vibration that is caused by traffic or other work being done on the site can lead to a trench cave-in. That's a long list and a grim one. But you need to understand these hazards to work safely in a trench. The good news is that your employer understands them too. With guidance from OSHA regulations, they've created policies and procedures that are designed to guard against these hazards and help prevent accidents and injuries on trenching projects. Before any digging starts in a new trenching project, the work site needs to be thoroughly inspected to identify potential hazards, so they can be controlled or eliminated. The individual who is responsible for safety on a trenching job is called the competent person. The competent person has the training and experience to identify any hazardous conditions on the job site, anticipate other hazards that are likely to develop, take the actions that are required to prevent or control these hazards. The competent person will also be familiar with various soil types and the protective systems that should be used to keep a trench safe and stable under various conditions. Soil testing and the selection of an appropriate protective system are crucial to safe trenching. We'll cover these procedures in more detail in the next chapter. The competent person will have a thorough understanding of OSHA's requirements for safe excavation as well, and they're authorized to take prompt action to control or eliminate hazards whenever it's necessary. That's why the competent person is likely to be a supervisor, so questions of seniority don't interfere with making the site as safe as possible as soon as possible. As we've discussed, utilities in the trenching area can be especially hazardous. They're easy enough to locate when they're above the ground, but not when they're under it. So the competent person will use an official one-call system to identify what underground utilities are present on the site and pinpoint their location. They can then be avoided, or when that's not possible, shut off, blocked, or otherwise secured for the duration of the project. Another thing the competent person will do is to oversee testing for hazardous atmospheres, and if they are found, arrange to ventilate the trench to remove them. The competent person will also ensure that emergency rescue equipment, such as breathing apparatus, safety harnesses and lines, or a basket stretcher, will be available on the site. Additionally, the competent person will determine whether any nearby structures or natural features, such as trees or boulders, could fall into the excavation, and arrange for proper safeguards if necessary. They will also inspect the site for surface water, such as ponds or streams that could divert into the trench, patterns of runoff that may lead water into the trench during a rainstorm, subsurface water that is present in the soil. Ditches or dikes can then be constructed or pumping equipment installed to reduce the potential for water hazards in the trench. The competent person will evaluate street traffic, mass transit, or other vehicular activity on or near the worksite as well. Signage, barriers, and high-visibility clothing will then be used as needed to control traffic and help prevent workers from being struck. Extra support may also be used to reinforce the trench against any collapses that may be caused by traffic vibration. As we've discussed, since trenches are naturally unstable, nearly all of them require some type of protective system to prevent cave-ins or shield the people who are working in them. In fact, OSHA safety rules require that any trench that is 5 feet or more deep must use some sort of protective system. Trenches less than 5 feet do not require a protective system if the competent person finds no potential for collapse. The type of soil on the site is a key factor in the stability of any trench, and the type of protection that the trench will need. Soil is categorized by how well it sticks together. This quality is called cohesion. A soil with more cohesion is less likely to collapse into a trench. Soils with less cohesion, such as those containing a lot of sand or gravel, are likelier to cave in. There are 4 types of soils. The most cohesive type is solid mineral matter called stable rock. Trenches that are dug into stable rock do not need a protective system. They are the only exceptions to OSHA's requirement for protection against cave-ins. Type A soil is less cohesive than stable rock, and Type B soil has less cohesion than Type A. Trenches dug in them do require protective systems. Type C soil is the least cohesive, and as a result, the least stable of all. It's the worst case type of soil. Trenching in Type C soil requires careful precautions to prevent cave-ins. It's important to remember that multiple types of soil can be found on one work site and even in a single trench. If for any reason a soil type on a site cannot be determined, you must assume it's the worst case, Type C soil. Before trenching begins on any site, the competent person will perform soil tests, evaluate the results, determine the most effective protective systems for the site's soil conditions. There are 4 basic types of protective systems: Two of these involve angling and shaping the walls of the trench to prevent cave-ins. Sloping cuts the sides of the excavation away from the trench bottom on an angle. Benching cuts the sides away in bench or stepped shapes. The angles of the slopes and the dimensions of the benches are determined by the types of soil and other conditions on the site. Sloping and benching may be used alone or in combination with each other, but benching should never be attempted in Type C soil. The two other protective systems are shoring and shielding. Shoring uses hydraulic, mechanical, or timber reinforcement to support the walls of a trench to prevent a cave-in from occurring. Shielding uses movable devices called trench shields or trench boxes. Their metal walls are designed to protect workers from the effects of a cave-in if one occurs. Personnel work inside the shielding system and move it along the trench as their work progresses. Even with protective systems in place, conditions on a trenching worksite can change from day to day, and sometimes from 1 hour to the next. These changes may affect the stability of the trench and protective system, or change the atmosphere from safe to hazardous. Conditions that affect the stability of a trench and protective system include weather, such as rain, snow, high winds, and freezing or thawing. Water that collects in the trench. The weight of materials or equipment that are placed near the edge of the trench. Shock or vibration from machinery moving along the edge of the trench or from other activity on the site. And as we've discussed, the atmosphere in a trench can also be a safety issue. Hazardous fumes or gases can be released as work progresses on the trench. They can accumulate in the trench overnight or build up during a work shift. For example, when gas or diesel-powered equipment is operating on the site. Your employer follows policies and procedures designed to protect you and your coworkers from hazards like these. First, OSHA requires the competent person to inspect the work site, trench, and protective systems before the start of each work shift. If any hazards are found, no worker will be allowed into the trench until corrective measures have been taken and the risk has been controlled or eliminated. Inspections will also be made throughout the work shift to determine if conditions have changed and adversely affected the site, such as after a thunderstorm or the passage of heavy equipment alongside the trench. If a hazard is identified, workers must leave the trench until the problem has been dealt with. Depending on the hazard, protective measures that might be taken can include installing shoring or shielding systems, equipping workers with safety harnesses and lifelines, pumping out accumulated water. Because water removal can create hazards of its own, this process will always be overseen by the competent person. OSHA also requires that trenches which are more than 4 feet deep and are at risk of developing hazardous atmospheres be tested at the start of each shift. If testing reveals an unsafe condition, adequate ventilation must be installed. If necessary, workers must put on respiratory protection before they can continue work in the trench as well. The air in the trench must then be retested as often as necessary during the shift to ensure that additional changes do not endanger workers. Even with protective systems in place and inspection and testing being conducted regularly, working on a trenching site can still be hazardous. Many accidents result from slips, trips, and falls that occur as workers enter and exit the trench. And sometimes being able to get out of a trench quickly could be a matter of life and death. So OSHA requires that any trench 4 or more feet deep be provided with safe means of access and egress. This can include ladders, stairways, or ramps. Ladders must be fastened securely in the trench inside its protective system. They must extend at least 3 feet above the trench's edge. This gives you something to hold on to so you don't lose your balance at the top. To make sure everyone can get out of the trench fast if they need to, Ladders, ramps, and stairways must be located no more than 25 feet from where people are working. Accidents can happen when you cross over a trench as well. Walkways must be provided for this purpose. A walkway that crosses an excavation that is more than 6 feet deep must be equipped with railings and toe boards to prevent people and tools from falling into the trench. The soil that is dug out of a trench is called spoil. When spoil piles or other materials or equipment are placed too close to the edge of a trench, their weight can cause the trench wall to collapse. So OSHA requires all materials to be placed at least 2 feet back from the edge of a trench. This setback also helps prevent these materials from sliding, rolling, or falling into the trench and onto the workers who are inside. If conditions on the site require it, retaining devices such as the trench shields that we discussed earlier can be used in these situations as well. To protect workers inside, a shield must extend at least 18 inches above the edge of the excavation. Mobile digging or lifting equipment that is being used to excavate a trench can also create problems. If it approaches too near the edge, it can cause a collapse or even fall into the trench itself. So equipment operators are required to keep their machinery back a safe distance, at least 2 feet from a trench's edge. When operators cannot get a clear view of how close their equipment is coming to the trench, hand or mechanical signals must be used to guide them. Barricades and stop logs can also be used as physical barriers to prevent the equipment from getting too close to the trench if space permits. On any worksite, preventing accidents and injuries requires teamwork. When you're involved in a trenching operation, you can do your part by working defensively. Like defensive driving, working defensively means thinking safety first every day and watching out for trouble so you can prevent it or avoid it before it causes an accident. Where should you start? Make a habit of following these safe work practices. They could save your life or someone else's. Never enter an unprotected trench that is 5 feet or more deep. Never enter any trench that has water in it, unless precautions have been taken to keep you safe. Never enter any trench of any depth that has not been approved for work by a competent person. Always wear a hard hat in a trench. Always stay inside the protective system of a trench. Never pass underneath or work below loads that are being handled by lifting or digging equipment. Always stand clear of any vehicle that is being loaded or unloaded. Always wear high visibility, reflectorized equipment when you are working on a site that is located near any type of vehicular traffic. Don't be complacent. Stay alert for dangerous situations that could cause accidents and injuries. If you notice a hazard, warn your coworkers about it. Control or eliminate the hazard if you can and are authorized to do so. Otherwise, tell your supervisor or the competent person so they can take care of it. If a cave-in occurs, do not enter the excavation yourself to try to rescue a coworker. You could be trapped in a secondary cave-in and become a casualty too. If you ever see a coworker overcome by hazardous fumes or gases, do not enter the trench or linger there to try to rescue them. Many would-be rescuers have been overcome as well and have died as a result. If an emergency does strike, inform your supervisor and call in first response professionals immediately. These groups have the equipment and training to deal with emergencies so that nobody else gets hurt. And remember that the best way to cope with a trenching accident is to prevent it from happening in the first place. As we've seen, trenching work can pose significant safety challenges, but those challenges can be met by following safe work policies and practices. Let's review. To prevent accidents and injuries on a trenching project, your employer will follow specific safety policies and procedures as required by OSHA. Before work on a trench begins, your employer will designate a competent person to inspect the worksite and identify potential hazards. Based on soil tests and any hazards they've identified, the competent person will determine the most effective type of protective system to use in the trench. The worksite, trench, and protective system will be inspected before the start of each shift, and as necessary during trenching activity. If conditions change, no workers will be allowed in the trench until any new hazards have been controlled or eliminated. When you're working on a trenching project, you can help keep yourself and your coworkers safe by being safety-minded and working defensively. Trenching work has its risks, but accidents and injuries don't have to happen. Now that you're aware of the potential hazards and know how to avoid them, you can help ensure that everyone goes home safe at the end of the day.